Welcome to our study. We're in chapter 6 of the book of Esther. And what we're going to consider today as Mordecai's reward. And it is evident that that reward was delayed. And then we also will see Haman's downfall. The writer relates in this text how the king, through God's providence, learned of the plot that was afoot and saved the people of Israel. Mordecai had saved his life, and he decides to honor him. And then he has a sleepless night. And during the course of that night, the king is made aware of this unrequited favor that this Jewish man has done, that it literally saved his life. And this leads immediately to an unusual encounter between the king and his prime minister, and leads to the humiliation of Haman and to the honoring of Mordecai, the Jewish servant of the king. Let's read the first 11 verses together, if you would, please. During the night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. In it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me, more than Haman?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you've said." So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai, and led him out on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." This part of the story is one which can simply be read and appreciated rather than having to be explained. And there's no exposition that's going to be offered by anybody that would add anything to the effect of just reading the story and let the reader be impacted by it. One can hardly keep from laughing aloud at Haman's mortification. Nevertheless, several facts need to be noted. As we begin with verse 1, during the night the king could not sleep. As the Hebrew text literally says, the king's sleep fled. We've probably all had that experience. His sleeplessness is one of the coincidences which were woven together by the Lord himself to bring about the Jews' deliverance. The king gave an order to bring the book of the records, the Chronicles. In other versions, this work is referred to as the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign in the New International Version. Yet another has the book of records, the Annals, the New Revised Standard Version. The Chronicle of the Memorable Events, the REB, and the records of what happened since he had been king of the CEV. The writing is also called the Book of the Chronicles in here and in chapter 2 and verse 23. One of the king's servants retrieved the book as ordered, and it was read to him. And this is an entirely believable method of trying to get back to sleep, because one can assume that chronicles of government proceedings and what have you are usually pretty dull and unexciting, and therefore would induce sleep. In this case, however, it was anything but that. One event caught the king's attention. In verse 2, the king's life had once been saved by information provided by Mordecai the Jew. And that account, of course, is not dull at all. It's an exciting thing. And it woke the king up rather than put him to sleep. It energized him. And a particular section of the book told how Mordecai had reported this conspiracy involving Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were the doorkeepers. And when this had happened, you will recall that Queen Esther had notified the king of the plans of these men, and they were thwarted. That deed had been recorded in the King's Chronicles. It was so significant. That's chapter 2, verse 21 through 23. But evidently, King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, had forgotten it, and so he's reminded now. Verse 3, the king reacted by asking one of his servants, well, what had been done to reward Mordecai for saving his life? Implied is the idea that one who provides such service deserves to be compensated. And we know from historical records that the Persian kings had a reputation for rewarding heroic and noble deeds. For example, Herodotus said that a man named Phylacus, who had captured a Greek ship during the Persian Wars, was enrolled in the king's benefactors, and he was presented with a large estate for his service. Even though Persian kings customarily rewarded such service, nothing at all had been done for Mordecai, so it was an oversight. In verses 4 and 5, hearing a noise, the king asked, who's in the court? And Haman had just entered the palace to ask the king's permission to execute Mordecai, to hang him on the gallows that he had built for that purpose. The servants informed the king that Haman was there, and they were instructed to have Haman come in. The chronology of these events is somewhat puzzling, at least for some. And we look at it, if the king couldn't sleep at the beginning of the night, and if Haman didn't arrive at the king's house until the morning, how could the king, having just learned from the chronicles of Mordecai's heroic act, have been asking for help at exactly the time that Haman arrived? Well, there are several scenarios that would explain that. The king might have heard about Mordecai's act early in the evening and thought about it all night before asking who was in the court. Or he might have listened to the reading of the Chronicles all night, not hearing the part about Mordecai until the wee hours of the morning. Or he could have gone to sleep and then awakened, having been unable to get back to sleep, and had the Chronicles read to him from very late at night until the morning. And so that's a non-problem, really. Verse 6, when Haman entered the king, asking, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? The self-centered, self-serving Haman immediately concluded that the king was asking him in a roundabout way what it was that he could do to honor Haman. After all, he thinks, well, who is more deserving of honor than I am? He's really not a very humble person, is he? Joyce G. Baldwin suggested that Haman's flawed perception might have been somewhat understandable. She explained that a king would often ask the recipient what gift he would like to receive. And by doing this, he would be certain that the gift that the person names would be one that he'd appreciate. However, instead of asking Mordecai, the king directs the question to Haman. Of course, the king expected to hear what his courtier would himself like to receive by way of honors, and anyone might have made the mistake that Haman made in assuming that he was to be promoted. In verses 7 through 9, as Haman answered, he pictured his own glorification. Such a man, he said, ought to be dressed in the king's robe, placed on the king's horse, and led through the city square with a nobleman crying out his praises. Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. He could almost hear the cheers and feel the adulation and the adoration that he would receive while riding the king's horse and wearing his robe. Haman's answer could have been interpreted as revealing his desire to supplant Xerxes, to occupy his throne. He was saying a great deal about what was in his own heart and the aspirations that he had for himself, or it may very well have been that way. And so the king might have deduced that there is a potential rival. Certainly, in this period of history, there were numerous coups d'etats attempted, and of course there is the assassination plot that we've already seen in chapter 2 and verses 21 through 23. Another idea is that Haman wanted to leave the impression that Xerxes had chosen him to be his successor. Nevertheless, the text doesn't really give any other hint at Haman's ambition to be king. One question remains regarding verse 8 is who wore the royal crown? Since the Hebrew text is ambiguous, it must have been either the horse or the honoree. Adele Berlin argued that the best interpretation is that the diadem had been put on the head of the horse when the king had ridden on it to indicate that it was he, the king, who was on that mount. Because there are reliefs at Persepolis that show Persian horses with crowns upon their head. In verse 10, Haman was jolted to reality when the king told him to do these things quickly for Mordecai the Jew. And the king ordered Haman to fulfill his fantasy, except the honor is going to be bestowed upon Mordecai, the person Haman despises more than any other person in the world. To say that Haman must have been shocked and upset and enraged is an understatement. It's hard to get your head around what his reaction must have been and the internal turmoil that must have descended upon him. In verse 11, the writer goes on to say that Haman did as the king directed. Well, of course he did. He had no other choice. But Mordecai is there. He puts him on the king's horse. He arrays him in the king's robe. He leads through the city square crying out, "This shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." How ironic. How ironic indeed that Haman is forced to honor the man that he'd hoped to hang. Verses 12 through 14, the narrative moves to Haman's justifiably received humiliation. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh's wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. The last 3 verses of the chapter tell the results of Mordecai's royal ride through the city square. Verse 12, after Mordecai has enjoyed this triumphant moment, being highly honored by the king himself, he resumed his usual place at the palace gate. The mortified Haman, the emotionally distraught Haman, who is now a wreck, flees to his house with his head covered, the sign of mourning. That is a sign of mourning that indicates a deep, deep sense of grief. In verse 13, at his home, he encounters Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, just as he had the day before. Again, he shares his feelings with them. But this time, it's a very different experience. Rather than recounting to them the glory of his riches and his other attainments, he recounted everything that had happened to him. He told them how he had been required by the king to honor the hated, despised Mordecai. And probably he hoped to receive comforting words from his friends and his wife. If he did, he was disappointed. His wife and his wise men instead said, if Mordecai is of Jewish origin, literally from the seed of the Jews, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. Were Zeresh's words like the words of Pilate's wife in Matthew 27 and 19? Prophetic words? Was she, along with the others, speaking of the Jews' deliverance from the edict which was to be enforced at the end of the year, preparing the hearers for things to come? Why does the text mention wise men? These were almost certainly the same men as those who are called his friends and all his friends in earlier chapters. They were among those friends, certainly the wise men were, and perhaps among Haman's friends was a small group of men who were regarded as his advisors and his counselors. When the speakers said, if Mordecai is of Jewish origin, it is highly unlikely that they have any question about that fact. The word if there should not be taken as implying some kind of uncertainty. It is rather a way of expressing a fact. It means since Mordecai is a Jew, you, sir, will not stand against him. These words, though they may sound strange, coming from the mouths of Persians, suggest a major theme of the entire book of Esther. And that is the Jews were invincible. And regardless of man's best or worst efforts to destroy them, nothing and no one could stand before them. Following the publication of Haman's edict, the Jews were probably on everybody's mind. There's undoubtedly a lot of talk going on. The writer recorded the conclusion reached by Haman's associates to make a point. To try to destroy the Jews was to commit suicide. The curious thing about this conclusion is that the wise men had not mentioned their belief in the Jews' invincibility earlier. Instead, they had suggested that Haman have Mordecai hanged. That was their suggestion. And their change of mind, I believe, can best be explained by the change of circumstances. That suggestion had been made before the emperor had decided to honor this man in the way that he did. Before, it appeared that Haman was powerful and Mordecai was powerless. Now it is obvious that Mordecai is powerful and that Haman's at his mercy. And so these men saw in this change of fortune an ominous sign of Haman's total and complete defeat, a foreshadowing of his further failure. This incident may provide a good example of how these reputed wise men in ancient Persia worked. They interpreted the signs of the times. Whatever happened, they reached conclusions about what would happen next. At this time, Haman had already begun to fall. Lindell saw the act of falling as being linked to Haman throughout this story. And the Hebrew word translated to fall links all of his descents as he is in the process all through the story. For example, the lot fell to determine the date for the Jews' destruction, chapter 3 and verse 7. The king told Haman not to fall short of what he said in honoring Mordecai in chapter 6 at verse 10. Haman's wife and friends said that he had already begun to fall and that he would surely fall before Mordecai in chapter 6 and verse 13. Finally, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and we'll see that in chapter 7 and verse 8. And this last act of desperation would seal his fate. In verse 14, the story continues its unrelenting progress toward Haman's downfall by announcing that just at that moment, the king's eunuchs arrived to escort Haman to Esther's banquet. And in fact, it says they hastily brought Haman to the banquet. Rather than going joyfully with the king to the banquet, just full of himself, Haman appears to have been forcibly hurried like a condemned man going to his execution. The tone of the narrative foreshadows Haman's utter defeat and death that will be recorded in the next chapter. Michael V. Fox saw Haman as falling under Esther's control. You know, the passivity of the last step, the eunuchs hastened Haman to the feast of that Esther had prepared, is significant. Haman, the skilled manipulator of the king's will, and he hopes a people's destiny, is no longer in control of his own life. He's rushed out and taken to a situation that Esther had prepared. He has been brought to her territory, and the initiative is now with her. Haman is at the mercy of the queen. And as we proceed to chapter 7, let's consider together the first 6 verses where it relates Esther's second banquet. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also that as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me, my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would have not been commensurate with the annoyance to the king." Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would presume to do thus?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. At the second banquet given by Esther for the king and for Haman, she finally tells Ahasuerus what it is that's troubling her. In verse 1, after being hurried away from his own home by the king's eunuchs, Haman had come to the king, with the king, to Esther's quarters to share the feast that she's prepared. In verse 2, the reference to the second day does not refer to the second day of a 2-day banquet, but rather to a separate banquet that happened to take place the next day. And as they drink their wine at the banquet, literally at the banquet of wine, on this occasion the king asked Esther for the third time what she desired. He repeated the words he had used before, asking, "What is your petition and what is your request?" Once more, he promised to give her whatever she wanted, even to the half of his kingdom. In verse 3, Esther answered graciously and politely, prefacing her request by appealing to the regard that the king had for her. He said, "If I have found favor in your sight." She said she would desire only what pleased the king. If it pleases the king, then she speaks directly about her concern, repeating the king's words. She said that for her petition was her life, and her request was the lives of her people. Esther's petition is verbalized in only 4 Hebrew words, translated into English: my life at my petition and my people at my request. In effect, she's saying, I want to live, and I want my people to live as well. I want them to survive. In verse 4, Esther immediately explained why it was necessary for her to come now and beg for her life. She had been sold, she and her people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Her choice of words make it obvious that she knows the details of Haman's plot, and she knows the words that he has used to deal with the king and the specifics of the decree that Haman had issued. She knows all of it. After all, her 3 words for the destruction of the Jews, destroyed, killed, and annihilated, reflect the actual words of the decree as it was written. And you see that in chapter 3, verse 13. The idea that she and her people had been sold probably refers to the bribe that Haman had promised the king. Of course, another possibility is that she was merely saying that they had been delivered up or given over. But I think that bribe was known to her. It would seem to me to be. Esther went on to say that if her people had only been sold as slaves, she wouldn't even have bothered the king about the matter. She said, for the trouble would not have been commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Carrie A. Moore commented that this is undoubtedly the most difficult clause to translate in all of the book, primarily because 3 of the 6 words are indeterminate in their meaning. The losses that the king was going to sustain from having these people slaughtered, the taxes they pay and all of that, are going to be a loss to him. And he needs to take note of that fact, not to mention it's morally repugnant. Perhaps the most significant part of Esther's reply is her identification with her people. Earlier, as Mordecai had instructed, she'd kept her Jewish heritage as a secret. She didn't reveal it. But now, faced with the people's destruction and the fact that she would likely be destroyed right along with them, she openly claimed the people as her people and equates her destiny with their destiny. What happened to them would happen to her. Presumably, her revelation at the dinner that she was a Jewess shocked her husband and certainly shocked Haman to the core of his being. Esther presented her request wisely and persuasively. She was polite, she was submissive, she was apologetic about the concern placed upon the king for a trivial matter. Her words apparently indicated that she knows that Haman has bribed the king. And she placed all the blame on Haman, ignoring the king's role in this decree. In verse 5, when Queen Esther stated her request, the king asked her, "Who is he and where is he who would presume to do thus?" Xerxes is not a temperate man in many ways, particularly when he's made angry. And so the king is now aware that a crime has been committed involving bribery and a threat to the life of his beloved queen. But as yet, the criminal has not been identified. So the king's asking, who had the audacity to do such a thing? And since the decree to destroy the Jews was issued in his name, one might ask, well, why would he ask such a question? John D. Livingston offered 3 possible answers to that, none of which present a very positive view of the king. Number 1, he may have been avoiding any responsibility since it appears that he's ignorant that Esther would be affected by the genocide. That doesn't speak very highly of his awareness. Secondly, he might have remembered that he'd authorized some group's destruction, but he's upset that the person who proposed this destruction didn't tell him that includes his beloved queen. That doesn't speak very well of him either. He may have been so upset or confused, thirdly, perhaps from drinking too much wine — you notice these Persians like their wine — that he forgot about the genocide. Whatever the explanation, the king's request gave Esther the opportunity that she sought to point an accusing finger at the murderous Haman. Verse 6, Esther wasted no time in answering the king. A foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman. The plan that she had carefully developed and followed has now come to fruition. And in the presence of the king, she's confronted Haman personally and denounced him for what he was: a foe, an enemy, a wicked man. In order to save her people, Esther had to first discredit the one person who is responsible for their impending destruction. And her evident intention is to make it clear to Ahasuerus that Haman was not only the Jews' foe, but he was also an enemy to the state, a traitor to the king. He has arranged for the destruction of an entire race of people who are loyal citizens, one of whom saved the king's life from a coup d'etat attempt. At that point, Haman knew that his doom is sealed and he has no hope of escaping execution. No wonder he's terrified before the king and the queen. Pick it up at verse 7. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine, and he went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Queen Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's anger subsided. The writer relates 2 very different responses from 2 very different men who heard Esther's words. One, the king arose angry from drinking wine, and he went out into the palace garden, presumably to gain control of himself and decide what he's going to do about the problem that has now been created. The king's anger may have stemmed from, in part, at least from the dilemma that he's now facing. Assuming that he remembers that he is ultimately responsible for the decree which would lead to the destruction of his own queen and her people, he had to be wondering how he could condemn Haman without condemning himself, and how he could save Esther, a Jewess, and her people when he has issued an irrevocable decree that they are to be destroyed. The other man, Haman, stayed to beg for his life from the queen. His only hope is to plead for mercy. Perhaps he thought he could persuade the queen to intercede on his behalf with the king to spare his life. Haman's proposal, verse 8, for help, his plea was his undoing. Because as he's begging for his life, he's falling on the couch where Esther was. And the custom in Persia was for people to recline when they were feasting. And probably she's still reclining on the couch as she had done during the banquet. Neil Richardson thought that Haman's falling on the couch was probably for the purpose of grasping and kissing her feet. This was an ancient Near Eastern gesture of humble petition. It was common. Whether this statement means that he was kneeling at her feet in a position of abject humility or that he accidentally fell on the queen is uncertain. But here's what is known. He was violating the rules that applied to the king's wives and the king's concubines. And when the king returns from the palace garden at exactly the right or the wrong time, if you're Haman, he sees him in this position, and the king is enraged, and he says, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? And perhaps he's relieved that he's not going to have to deal with Haman for his crimes against the Jews, since he can now execute him for attempting to assault the queen. I don't know, but the guards certainly recognized in the king's tone and in the king's words that this is a death sentence. So they cover Haman's face, and he is condemned to death. The only decision left to be made after the servants covered his face is the time, the place, and the manner of his execution. One of the king's servants, Harbona, knew about Haman's plan to murder Mordecai, and he told the king all about it. And he said that Haman had built a gallows at his house 50 cubits high on which he was going to hang Mordecai. He intended for it to be a public display. The fact that this eunuch knew about it, it means it was noised abroad. And so the king said, hang him on it. Verse 10, according to the king's command, they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. Then, with the execution of his enemy, the king's anger subsided, and he vented his wrath on the man whom Esther had blamed for threatening her life. Now it appears that all is well. However, the Jews' problem is not altogether solved. Haman's decree, made with the king's authority, remains, and on a certain date later in the year, the Jews are to be annihilated. And the king's decree could not be revoked or altered, not even by himself. The Jewish people are still in danger. And the next chapter of the story reveals how this hurdle will be overcome. And I hope that you'll tune in for that.